And it's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu. And over the next hour, we'll bring you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. So I'm very excited because coming up, we'll be talking to our Byline Times diarist and famous for a long career in journalism, Peter Oborne, about David Cameron and Boris Johnson, who he worked with at Spectator, and what the future holds for those two men.
We'll also be joined by our social affairs reporter Sian Norris, and we'll be talking to Dr. Julia Patterson of the Every Doctor Group about a court case that they are launching with the Good Law Project against the government over PPE.
But first, we don't have a Rupert Murdoch to look after us. In fact, you are our mini Murdochs. We could not do this show without you because, unlike GB News, which has a Dubai hedge fund, or the BBC, which has a license fee, we only have you to support us and fund us to make these regular TV shows. So if you can, do sign up on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Byline TV, patreon.com/Byline TV, where you can fund us. And thank you so much for the people who've also signed up on YouTube. Thanks particularly to Mr. Deep Sea Amanda for joining today.
Well, Peter, should we have a look at our front page?
Our digital front page, yes. Suppression and revolt. I think you came up with that headline, Hardeep. What does that mean?
I think I did, yes. We were looking at some of the main developments this week, and it's been quite a busy one, actually, in politics. So at the start of the week, we had the announcement that there will be a COVID inquiry in spring 2022. It will be under the Inquiries Act 2005, so it will have the power to call witnesses who can give evidence under oath, which is very important. And we'll be looking at more of that later on in the episode. And then, of course, we had the Queen's speech, which was very concerning in some ways. So the government was introducing some proposals. They said it was to protect electoral integrity, things such as people requiring IDs to vote in the future.
What we call, and Americans call, as we say on our front page, voter suppression. How many people don't have an ID?
Well, I mean, disproportionately, this change would likely to affect younger people and those in minority communities. And also, I think in the last elections that were held, there were only 6 cases of electoral fraud that emerged. So,
well, there's a great line, I think, in one of our articles. There were more investigations into the Prime Minister this year than there are convictions for voter fraud in the last 2 years.
Later on in the week, the former Prime Minister, David Cameron, also appeared before MPs. He was giving evidence with regards to his involvement in the Greensill scandal, which saw him lobbying on behalf of the financial services company during the COVID crisis. And again, it was quite an eye-opening appearance. He was explaining that his motivation for lobbying key government ministers such as Rishi Sunak and other prominent civil servants wasn't actually motivated by any notion that he had shares in the company or he's paid by the company, which of course he was. He was just saying that he was trying to, in a way, help the government at a time that it was experiencing an economic heart attack in the virus. And then finally, there was quite a heartwarming story to emerge, which we saw on the streets of Glasgow. So there's quite an interesting turn of events there. Earlier in the day, immigration enforcement van turned up because 2 refugees which were housed in one of the buildings in a particular street in Glasgow, they were due to be taken away and deported. The police arrived, but so did thousands.
No, but it was the border force.
But it was the border force
arrived.
Okay.
And then thousands of protesters lay down the street. And then the Scottish police Scotland, came and released them. It's an amazing story. Encouraged by Nicola Sturgeon and the Justice Minister, this was unfair. It's quite a Muslim area, that part of Glasgow, I believe, and it was the last day of Eid, wasn't it? So, that was a very provocative moment.
Yeah, and again, people have been marching through Glasgow today again, saying refugees are welcome here. So, but this story really kind of introduce some interesting elements with regards to, we already know there are tensions within the union itself between Scotland and another independence referendum potentially down the line. The SNP stopped short of a majority, but did very well
And
in
with
the elections
Greens,
last
there's a
week.
majority for a referendum.
Yeah, and so the union is already teetering, but I think this was just one small example, quite a powerful example, of how perhaps there is a real difference in values or a perception of values in Scotland as opposed to Westminster. Of course, in Westminster we have the Home Secretary Priti Patel introducing her new plan for immigration, introduced all sorts of measures looking at refugees, looking at migrants, asylum seekers, and it is part of the promised crackdown that the Vote Leave government promised, so we'll have to see how that goes.
Well, joining us now from his abode in Wiltshire is a man now famous as Byline Times' diarist, but I think had a more illustrious and amazing career working for most of the mainstream press, including chief political correspondent for the Mail under Sir Paul Dacre, at the Telegraph, where he left on a very high-principled fashion over issues of advertising and editorial independence, and, as he can tell us, he worked with our current Prime Minister, who was then editor of Spectator some years ago. Welcome, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
A huge pleasure to join you, and a huge pleasure to write the Byline Times diary. It enables me to get quite a lot off my chest.
Well, and also get into a little contretemps with somebody you know, Jacob Rees-Mogg. I think you left this month's diary on a bit of a cliffhanger, didn't you?
Well, we did, because I sent a letter to Mr. Rees-Mogg, who I've always regarded as rather an honourable man who with a strong sense of propriety, following his remarks on the floor of the House of Commons about Aj Singh, a journalist at Huffington Post, who he accused of, my words, not his, I think, doctoring or messing around with quotes from the Foreign Secretary. And that's a very serious allegation to make about a journalist, that he's messed around with quotes. Anyway, I wrote a letter to Jacob at his office as leader of the House, and I'd written all about it when on deadline, as I got this call, it's Jacob help, no surrender. Anyway, he's standing by his claim about Aj Singh. So what I've told him is I will go away. I'm now going to put a wet towel around my head and study the full details of this episode. And if I decide, having got my private investigations out, to Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg was telling the truth, I will give in. I will hail this great figure of total integrity. But if not, I'm going to call him. I told Mr. Rees-Mogg, I'm going to call you a liar.
So we did actually, because he did get back to you, slightly change the language, because you thought this was, at that time...
Well, it was decent of him to get back to me. Yeah. The point is that I'm giving him credit for that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's proper and decent of him to get back and engage.
And that's an amazing thing about your work, that you do engage with your subjects pretty comprehensively. And for those who haven't seen it, you don't want to challenge Peter Oborne to a research quiz, because you have documented... and we've got to update it, you plan to update it, how many lies by the current Prime Minister and Cabinet? I mean, obviously you have written a book about this, but you sent to the Speaker of the House of Commons 13 or 14 lies before, or let's say misleading statements before Parliament. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, Byline Times was very kind and published this. He sent a list of 15 false and misleading statements, to use the correct parliamentary language, made by Boris Johnson and his ministers on the floor of the House since Mr. Johnson became Prime Minister in July 2019. And that's extraordinary. It doesn't happen before. There's been a convention in British public life that Prime Ministers and Cabinet Ministers don't tell falsehoods on the floor of the House, and if they do, they correct them. That's been abandoned as a matter of procedure since Mr. Johnson became Prime Minister. And so I sent this list off to Mr. Speaker and off to Johnson himself, actually, and to Rees-Mogg and to Keir Starmer and various whereas others, that full list is public. Well, it's a very partial, not a full list, it's a selective list. I also have a list of, I should think, 300 or 400 other lies or misleading statements made in other contexts. And I need to I need to sort of do something with that list. It's very getting longer and longer. Every week you'll get another dozen or so. And I need to, but as you can imagine, it's an enormous task assembling them, researching them, and I'm very scrupulous. You know, I will always, if I make a mistake, I'll always acknowledge it. I never have yet. Nobody's challenged anything I've ever written.
So it's a bit like painting the fourth bridge. By the time you cover the last lies, many lies have come forward. So because you've been around, and certainly longer in journalism than I have, and hard deep, where did the rot set in? I mean, you've been brilliant. These are sometimes your friends, your colleagues. You are, I wouldn't say remorseless, assiduous in covering misrepresentations in the media. Just so people understand, I first came across your work really when I, as it became a journalist and got involved in the phone hacking scandal, and you stood up for the excellent work of Nick Davies from The Guardian, who exposed it, and you spoke about this code of silence. And so you had this truth-telling element, but you were One Nation conservative. I don't think that's unfair to say. You have a conservative background. Where did the Conservative Party, to our eyes, lurch towards this kind of mendacious populism? You watched the parliamentary appearance of former Prime Minister David Cameron before MPs this week. What do you make of his role, if you like, in the decline and fall of the Conservative Party as a party of honour?
Yeah, well, a party which honoured due process, pragmatism, the institutions of state, and a lot of people object to what I'm going to say because on the left, but I've always argued that really the difference between conservatism, and it's not my original argument, it's an argument made by Burke, Oakeshott, explicitly, that the Conservatives are wary of grand projets. They realise it's trying to change the world is a very dangerous thing to do. You can really only change small things you can genuinely affect, and that means being kind to your neighbours, for instance, but also doing things which you know are right, like telling the truth, obeying the law, getting engaged with your local community. Now, what's happened with the current Conservative Party is it's abandoned that respect for due process entirely under Boris Johnson. Well, now, where did the rot set in? I'll tell you where it didn't set in, and again, this offends my friends, my growing number of friends on the left. I didn't set in under Maggie Thatcher. I did a very thorough search of Mrs. Thatcher at lying as Prime Minister. And it was a massive meme on the left that she was a great liar. She wasn't. There was almost no lying made by Mrs. Thatcher. She employed a civil servant, Bernard Ingham, as her spokesperson. He was actually from the left, and she didn't even ask what his politics were when she employed him. And it was not true. And John Major was a pretty respectable fellow, despite the great sort of barrage of insult which was aimed at him.
Particularly from Rupert Murdoch's stable, which was shifting allegiance to Tony Blair at that point.
Which switched dramatically in 1996, and this sort of very unfortunate deal was struck between Blair and Murdoch.
So this tradition of, we'll get to lying in a moment, is not one. I remember Thatcher, there was a wobbly moment with Michael Heseltine and the Westland had and Leon Britton briefing somebody, but this was almost resignation time over something now.
It was accepted that had she been proven to lie over Westland, I suspect she did, by the way. I didn't say she was entirely. She would have had to resign. Right. But Neil Kinnock failed to. It wasn't proven.
But there was a principle: if somebody lied then once before Parliament, not 15 times, that was a resignation matter in the Conservative Party. This was so. This, in a way, moving away. Just so people understand, Edmund Burke, who Peter referenced, was the great. He argued in the French Revolution, revolutionary things. tend to disturb, men of violence, terror happens, and these small battalions of people and the rule of law is the thing that preserves us sort of, from...
But Burke's insight was that, if you sweep away the institution, something worse will happen. And he wrote it on the eve of the French, or while the early days of the French Revolution were spectacularly vindicated during the Terror.
But we have people now, you would say, who sweep away those institutions. I mean, we document it a lot in Byline Times. Maybe we could just hone in on one person in particular this week, David Cameron. I mean, we have talked about this before, just to flag up the audience. And we were discussing before that, when you think of Gordon Brown, he's been quite quiet, Theresa May. But then this extraordinary sequence of events with David Cameron, I think there's 52 emails. How deep is it? 52 emails?
56.
56. How did you feel about that, and what did you think should happen with David Cameron?
Yeah, well, this is a new phenomenon. It's the abuse of public office after you've left office. Prime ministers actively enriching themselves after on the basis of having been prime minister. I made a film about Tony Blair, a major investigation into Tony Blair's finances after he left office. It was called The Wonderful World of Tony Blair. It absolutely showed how Blair was profiteering on on the connections he'd made in Number 10, particularly with foreign leaders. I went around the Gulf. It was pretty horrific, actually, what we learned. Now, I think after Gordon Brown, I think was flawless. His reputation rises all the time as an ex-prime minister. The same applies to Mrs. May. But I really don't think that the same can be said of David Cameron, who's absolutely embarrassed not just himself, but the office of prime minister, and also the Queen, because his conduct in using the fact that he was prime minister to ring round and lobby, almost in quite a sinister way.
But it's just slightly different from Tony Blair, isn't it? Tony Blair technically was for a foundation, and he raised millions. But anyway,
being generous, because he had it. There was a foundation, but there was also a private office. I'm not going to go.
I'm not going to defend him. But then the key thing was he wasn't going as far as we know with 56 emails. Sometimes saying "love Dave" or "love DC." Lobbying ministers in a government he used to lead. Well, it's a different government.
That's correct. And Cameron so far has not shown nearly enough remorse. But also, we need to stop this happening again. It's clear the system has been unable to cope with it. And he's disgraced the office of prime minister. He's lowered the. We're used in some countries where former leaders get involved in all sorts of disgraceful things. That hasn't happened in this country. I think it's important for the integrity of public life in this country that he should be stripped of his Privy Councillorship as a strong message that this is he's betrayed the British Constitution and the Queen above all, because as Prime Minister you are the advisor to the Queen. That is your constitutionally your premier position. The Privy Council is a group of ministers and other individuals who are eminent, who have a duty to advise the Queen. And I think it would be wholly appropriate and right that Mr. Cameron should be stripped of that office.
Also,
it's an office of honour advising the Queen, and he should be stripped of it.
Also, I think we were going to find out the figures. I'm not sure they got to you in time, but he receives a substantial pension from the state.
No, that's another matter. I think that's we should contemplate whether we should strip him of the 100,000 or so a year which a Prime Minister gets to sort of pursue his duties. He's clearly unfit.
And unlike Prince Harry, who has had it withdrawn, and Princess Michael of Kent and Prince Michael still get it. He has diplomatic protection status, so we pay for his detail. Obviously, we want his security. So the state is still funding David Cameron to an extent. He did not. Hardeep, you watched the whole hearings.
It's about 120,000, well, maybe 120,000 a year.
But that would be
Prime Minister.
Chicken feed.
And he'll get a pension of 40 grand a year. And I think there's a strong argument that he should be stripped of all of that. And also, we need to have legislation to prevent another. It's clear that the informal arrangements haven't worked, they haven't been enforced. And so I think that we need legislation to prevent British Prime Ministers in future seeking to get in contact with former colleagues and officials to put pressure on them to act. And all these dealings should now be made fully public.
And Peter, would you go as far as to say that the Conservative Party has gone from the party of due process to a party that is embroiled in corruption? I mean, do you think that is a word that we need to be using with regards to British politics at the moment? Do you think it's hyperbolic? Do you think it's accurate?
I think you can't use the word corruption unless you can prove that criminal acts have taken place. At the moment, all that's been shown is that improper behaviour, cronyism, absolutely, the handing on a massive scale of public deals to people who are Tory party donors, and often again without competition. All that needs to be explored and investigated. But corruption is, if you're corrupt, you're saying that somebody is a criminal, accepting a bribe or giving a bribe or whatever that may be. And so I just be very careful about using that word. But you can certainly say with complete accuracy that there's a culture of sleaze and cronyism, and a complete disregard of rules in Mr. Johnson's government, starting, of course, with Mr. Johnson himself, who has grossly ignored the rules of British public life. He's broken every single Nolan principle introduced under John Major. It shouldn't be forgotten, of sort of openness, accountability, honesty, integrity, leadership, and so on, which was blessed, which was introduced by Lord Nolan and blessed by the Major government. All of those are smashed, none of them apply. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that no minister has declared his interests since July last year, because they sacked, or no, I must rephrase that, because Alex Allen, the minister, the ethics advisor responsible for monitoring ministerial interests, left in November following a disagreement about allegations of bullying made against the Home Secretary. He left in that, and then we haven't had until the arrival of Lord Guyte, a ministerial advisor on ethics or standards. And so they've just abandoned announcing their interests. So we don't know what Mr. Johnson's connections are paying him or giving him, or what benefits he's been receiving from them. And that applies, of course, to Hancock, for instance, the Health Secretary, and all of the other cabinet ministers. It's quite horrifying. It's disgusting, actually. But the word corruption I would be careful about that, because we can't prove that ministers have taken bribes.
So this begs the question for me, Peter, is what do you think's changed in that 20 years, 30 years since Major and Thatcher, whatever their ideology is, they didn't expect to mint it, or rather the discrepancy of incomes from Boris Johnson, who thinks 250,000 a year from your former employees, the Berkeley brother, singular now, was chicken feed. If something happened to British society where they are mixing with oligarchs with super yachts, 5 properties in London, maybe some in around the world, that a prime minister just thinks they are poor unless they somehow move to this territory where it's mooted, millions of share value could have accrued to David Cameron had the Green Seal deal gone ahead. Is that a change in British society which makes them feel they are poor?
I don't think it's necessarily a change in British society, although I think there has been, and I do think that the number of people who've made a fortune has increased. That's not altogether a bad thing, by the way. You think it's, if you believe in free market capitalism and that it generates wealth all round. But what has happened, and I've witnessed it and recorded it as a political journalist, I've written about it, is basically the funding of the major political parties, this is Tory and Labour, has moved from the mass membership, including in Labour's case, the unions, to donors, the rise of the donor class. There needs to be a book about this, and there's a prime minister now, and on the way up too, the senior ministers suddenly find themselves mingling with these incredibly rich people who. And it's quite jolly nice. You get invited for wonderful weekends away. You go off in helicopters, and they provide the helicopters and the private planes. Who's paid for Mr. Johnson's recent sort of perambulations during the election campaign? We need to know that. And that suddenly, and they're invited to Mustique. Off Mr. Johnson goes to Mustique with that as well. That's one of the inquiries, with the super rich, rubbing shoulders with them. And I think this is absolutely corrupting. I think it happened with Blair too.
But
Blair was very guilty of being transfixed, I think, by the super rich. And the same happens with Johnson, and it's jolly nice, jolly comfortable, and very amusing. I mean, remember when George Osborne, before he became Chancellor, wanders onto Oleg Deripaska's yacht, or Johnson, when he's Foreign Secretary, sort of flies down to this sort of his name is Lebedev, who owned, I can't remember if he still does, the Evening Standard, and it's got all sorts of oligarchical qualities. The lack of discrimination, and it takes you away from ordinary voters, it takes you away from ordinary people, and it takes you away from real party activists. And you're suddenly, there you are, you're living in this gilded society in London. It started most noticeably under Tony Blair. Right. He just went out of his way to remove the influence of the trade unions, who I believe still are a solid part of British society. One of the, that's how World War II was won, very largely because the unions threw their weight thanks to Bevin. Yeah, that's what he did, and they went full out for war, but Tony Blair turned his back on the unions, brought in the donor class, and of course they want money, they want something in return.
Yeah, and there's we have a film coming up soon. It's a lot of filming going on. It'll be out after the summer with John Sweeney about those famous trips to Perugia, where the Lebedevs have their mansion, and some of the things which happen there. We must also mention your book, Peter, because we talked a lot about Boris Johnson and his problems with the truth. You ought to remind viewers of the name of your book. What's it called again?
It's very nice of you.
No, but I forgot the name, actually.
Well, it's called, I normally have one immediately to hand to wave around. Yes. I can't find it. It's called The Assault on Truth.
Thank you.
The emergence of a new moral barbarism.
But before we go, one last question. And we did start the show mentioning this sort of interesting moment in Scotland where the border force were stopped from removing 2 asylum seekers from Glasgow Street by protesters and actually then Police Scotland. What do you think, as somebody I assume was a Conservative and Unionist, what do you think are the pressures on the Union of the United Kingdom under this regime?
Well, by the way, you said earlier you sort of left the impression earlier they were Muslim. I'm not absolutely, I haven't followed the
area was a well-known Muslim area. I'm not sure either. Yeah, that's all.
They may not be Muslim, but there we are.
Yeah.
I think it is potentially a constitutional issue. Alternatively, you could regard it as an issue of public order around the country, that the draconian policies of the Home Office are going to be resisted. You don't have to see it. And I would, as a unionist, I would perceive it in those terms as much as an issue between Scotland and Westminster. Right. I think the Home Office has been extremely heavy-handed, and they've been sending out horrible messages in some cases about the treatment of people who are vulnerable. And so perhaps it should be seen in that light as well.
Well, I understand they were Sikh, which is the same background Hardeep. That's what the reports are. But they were asylum seekers anyway, and they were released aftermath. Peter, thank you.
I think it's an interesting moment. It was an interesting and important moment.
I mean, it struck me, reminded me a bit of the protests in Scotland against the poll tax. It was trialled there a year before in the UK. But we'll see how that develops. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. We get you in the studio, out of your Wiltshire retreat someday, into the big city. We have some exciting projects coming up, and thanks so much for joining us. And all you do
looking
for
forward. I just say how much I'm really enjoying writing for Byline Times. Thank you very much for.
It's a real thank you, Peter. It's great to have you.
Bye-bye. See you later.
Lots to think about there, Peter. That's really interesting, isn't it? I thought Peter's comments about corruption were particularly interesting as well, just because I think we were having a conversation earlier in the week, weren't we, in light of a piece that Ian Overton had written for Byline Times, where he had said corruption doesn't actually come with just one smoking gun. It's more of a it's more sort of the water we swim in almost, or the water that people can swim in.
Yeah, it was this idea of institutional corruption, where it's not individuals conspiring, but there's a confluence of interest and money. And of course, this will be very relevant in a couple of weeks' time with the Daniel Morgan independent panel, which is looking at police corruption around a notorious 34-year-old movie.
Yeah, but I think it's one that we'll keep looking at, this distinction absolutely, almost journalistically, and as rightly, as Peter said, journalistically, we need to be very careful about describing only certain behaviour which is proven to be criminal in that way is corruption, because obviously corruption is a criminal offence. But also I think we're going to keep looking, certainly at Byline Times, about this wider sense of corruption and seeing it as part of the culture, which I think in Britain, and I've highlighted this before, we're not too used to doing.
It's a bit like, I always think of the great line from Hamlet, there's something rotten in the state of Britain, but it's something rotten, you don't know where it is.
Exactly. Now, the COVID inquiry, that's what we're going to be looking at next. We're going to be joined by Sian Norris and Dr. Julia Patterson to have a look at some doctors who will be taking the government to court alongside the Good Law Project next week with regards to PPE and how it did not protect health workers. But just before that, we're going to introduce a preview for you. This is Sam Bright, Byline Times' chief investigations and politics reporter, interviewing the former government chief scientist, Sir David King, about the coronavirus crisis and how the government could have saved up to 100,000 lives.
Sir David currently chairs Independent Sage, which gives transparent advice about the coronavirus pandemic to the government and the public at large. I really appreciate you joining us on Byline TV, Sir David. So the government said that it's followed the science during the pandemic. What's sort of your been reading of it?
Well, the key test of any government that says it's following the science is, are the scientists able to say what advice they're putting into government? And the reason we set up Independent Sage in the first place was because we didn't even know who the members of Sage were that had been set up to manage this epidemic back in February, March last year. So I mean, if you look at Independent Sage, we were set up in order to be transparent about what we thought the advice ought to be to government at each stage of the epidemic in Britain. So when it came to the need for a lockdown in October, November, and approaching Christmas, it is very clear, because the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer put their advice into the public domain, that they were calling for a lockdown, and the Prime Minister was not taking that advice. And now, of course, every Chief Scientific Advisor knows this. You are giving advice, you're not making the decisions. And so I would never disagree with the decision that my Prime Minister made. I would simply say, this was my advice.
Of course. And obviously we've seen a staggering death toll in this country from the pandemic. What do you think the key missteps have been during this long, year and a bit now?
Delays in going into lockdown. That's the first thing. And that is really critically important, because if you have a disease that has got out of control, and of course I'm going to say that should never have happened to allow it to get under control, but if it has got out of control, so the pandemic has gone right across the country, it's appearing in every town and village, you have no choice but to go into lockdown. It's a blunt instrument. You're asking everyone to isolate from everybody else, not just the people who have the disease. So each time, starting with March, we should have gone into the first lockdown on the 5th of March, not on the 23rd of March. And this is the point at which the disease presence in the country, in terms of the number of people going down with it, was doubling every 3 to 4 days. It was quadrupling every week. Right? So this is when the pandemic took off. And you might remember in the early stages, even right up to the summer last year, we were hearing that you have to have a balance. It's not just separate people out who have the disease, etc. It's what are we doing to our economy? We've got to have the economy fully up and running. This is a totally false dichotomy. There is no difference between managing an epidemic properly and managing it for your economic growth properly. Because if you do separate everyone else, everyone who has the disease and has been in contact with them from everybody else, your economy runs on. And I think that was another thing that really rather frustrated me. And the question has got to be, we don't know the answer to this. Were the advisors saying this? It is possible.
I wanted to ask you as well about the outsourcing of government work during this pandemic. Obviously, we've seen billions spent and billions more planned to be spent on test and trace, on personal protective equipment, etc. What have your reflections on being on that great outsourcing effort?
I think what is interesting is that the outsourcing is public money being spent in the private sector to manage a pandemic while it's in full flow, literally in full flow. And so this isn't what the private sector is particularly good at, is competition. If there's some money available to do a job, set up the competition and see how efficient it is. And that tends to run more efficiently than a publicly funded enterprise. But if we look at the public health service, this public health service that we have, that has been severely underfunded since 2010, which is a major part of our crisis, the public health service is the best way to handle a pandemic. Right? That is how you handle it. You don't handle it by pumping taxpayers' money into the private sector without any competition. And then the question has to be, the companies that received the funds from government, were these companies the experts in healthcare? I'm going to suggest that actually none of them knew anything about healthcare. They had to get consultants in at great expense to give them any knowledge and information about healthcare. And then we have our general practice system and our hospital system, where the expertise is. If we had pumped public money into improving the ability of our health service to respond, I'm pretty confident we would have got a much, much better result. The rollout has been...
Now, for months, politicians, campaigners and the bereaved have been calling on the government to commit to a date as to when a public inquiry will be held into the coronavirus crisis. This week, Boris Johnson finally said in Parliament that an inquiry will be held in the spring of 2022, and it will be held under the Inquiries Act of 2005. Previous viewers of Byline TV and Friday Night with Byline Times will know that Brian Cathcart, who's a guest a few weeks back, was saying that an inquiry under the 2005 Act really would be crucial because of the powers that it enables those conducting it has. So under the Inquiries Act, evidence will be taken under oath by witnesses. However, questions have been raised as to whether spring 2022 is a strategic date, which would simply come too late in terms of learning some of the vital lessons that we need to know now with regards to Britain's handling of the COVID crisis. I'm now joined by Sian Norris, our social affairs reporter, who's in the studio with us. Sian, thank you for having me back.
It's
great.
So nice to be back.
Fantastic. So you've been reporting in recent weeks around one aspect of these lessons that potentially have still not been learned or clarity has still not been gained on with regards to the COVID crisis, specifically around the experience of frontline healthcare workers. So tell me a little bit about some of the issues which are still coming up there and about the long-lasting impact of the coronavirus crisis on the people who've been affected on the front line.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a really interesting piece of research that came out a couple of weeks ago from the University of Roehampton, looking at the mental health impact that the coronavirus crisis had had on frontline workers. And one of the headline findings was that there were quite concerning levels of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly on those who worked in the front line, and also particularly women, which is again the majority of healthcare workers in the NHS. And what was crucial was that they found the lack of PPE and a lack of workplace preparedness had an impact on that PTSD. So people going into work in this very frenetic, very frightening, very uncertain time, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, not having the correct equipment, not feeling safe, not knowing what to do or what was going to happen, clearly was having a mental health impact. And I think one of the really concerning aspects is there is still this line coming out from the government that there was no national PPE shortage. Matt Hancock went on Radio 4, he said there was never a national shortage, there were individual challenges. Well, number one, we all remember the news pictures from the beginning of the pandemic. We remember seeing those photos of healthcare workers in bin bags. You know, it's ridiculous to sort of say that even if these were individual challenges, that's a huge challenge for those people, and we should be listening to healthcare workers and we should be respecting their experience.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that's just such a pertinent example of something, a government line that is still being stuck to now with regards to PPE, and therefore questions are rightly raised as to whether the government has learnt these lessons and whether spring 2022 is going to be soon enough to, you know, get some clarity on some of these real issues.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, there's concern now at the Boris Johnson press conference this afternoon about this Indian variant. Is there going to be a third wave? Healthcare workers have gone through a year of, you know, horrific circumstances, seeing their colleagues die, living with that fear, you know, working all the time. Even in the so-called lull in the summer, that was a time when healthcare workers were really, really busy doing the elective surgery, looking after patients that had not been able to get treatment during the height of the crisis. So they're going into this potential third wave exhausted and still not confident necessarily that the lessons of the last 12 months will have been learned to keep them safe in the future.
And now we're very, very pleased to be joined by Dr. Julia Patterson, who is an NHS doctor. She's also the chief executive of the Every Doctor group. Now, next week, alongside the Good Law Project, the group will be taking the government to court over PPE and the impact it's had on frontline workers. But to tell us a lot more, here's Julia. Julia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I just want to clarify, I haven't actually been working in the NHS during COVID because I've been running Every Doctor, and very early on it became apparent that the doctors that we represent, many of them didn't have safe PPE, and things became very scary very quickly. And so actually I had to stop working clinically in order to focus full time on lobbying for their protections.
And just, can you outline to us what the court case that's coming up involves?
Yes, so it involves several companies, none of whom have significant experience in procuring PPE in the past for the NHS. And huge sums of public money have been given to these companies, we feel inappropriately, at the height of the pandemic. And from what we can establish, it looks like those procurement deals weren't entered into competitively following normal process. We also, during the sort of investigation that's gone on over the last 12 months with our legal team, a VIP channel has been discovered, which shows that if an individual or a small company had links with a minister, they were being fast-tracked in some cases to be given PPE contracts. And obviously, as healthcare workers, many of whom had no PPE or had insufficient PPE, we feel absolutely appalled that this situation has occurred. It's appalling that we were short of PPE in the first place, which is in part because the government ignored the guidance that came out of a report that came out in 2017, advising them to prepare ahead of a potential pandemic. But it's also appalling that in the event of a pandemic, proper process wasn't followed. And you know, we work within a system in healthcare where process must be followed, accountability matters, transparency matters, honesty matters, and it feels like that went by the wayside. And so we felt it was really important to challenge the government on this so that it doesn't happen in the future.
And what have your members been telling you over the past 12 months about those challenges in terms of getting PPE, but also that fear, the mental strain of not having the PPE that they needed?
Yeah, I mean, it was a hugely variable picture across the UK. So I don't think there was one homogenous experience amongst NHS staff. We built a data tool very quickly to try and map out who didn't have PPE, where the shortages were across the country. And what became apparent was people who were working in intensive care units or where procedures which are called aerosol generating procedures were carried out. They're sort of medically invasive procedures which were thought to bring a lot of COVID particles in the air. People within those intensive environments did have safe PPE on the whole, but the further away you move clinically from that acute environment, so people working in the community, people working in GP surgeries, porters, telephone operators, anyone who wasn't in one of those highly intense environments wouldn't have been provided with that same level of PPE. And many of those people died on the front line. The Lotus report from the ONS shows that over 880 health and social care workers died. The majority of them were in clinical scenarios where they wouldn't have been given the full PPE that we see on the news with the long gowns and look completely covered. A lot of people, even people seeing patients to this day, are only provided with one of those flimsy blue surgical masks and a plastic apron and we still feel it's inadequate, to be honest.
Really, that's really quite shocking, Julia. So currently, despite everything that we have been through in this country collectively, but in terms of the NHS, you're saying that the only PPE that's kind of usually provided is a mask and a plastic apron currently? Yeah.
So what emerged in March last year was we realised very quickly that there was a supply problem with PPE. And there was also a policy problem. So it was a twofold problem. There was a problem whereby our PPE policy in the UK didn't match up to what the WHO were recommending. And one of the biggest jobs every doctor had was to lobby, first of all, for eye protection, which we did manage to secure. So people do have access to goggles if they need them now. But the other part of PPE that we were lobbying for, which we're still lobbying for, is full coverage gowns for everybody. And unless you're in one of those AGP areas, you're not given a gown, you're given a plastic apron, which doesn't provide very good coverage. The other thing that we fall down on, and a lot of people agree with us on this, is that we feel that every person, every health and social care worker should be given respirator masks if they're in an environment where they're assessing someone for suspected COVID, because there is increasing evidence to suggest that COVID is an airborne disease, and that means that it isn't only people who are in one of those AGP areas who are at risk of contracting the virus. Anybody could be if they're, in a healthcare environment where COVID is in the air. And so everybody should be afforded the same protection, and that's not happening. Now, health bodies in the UK have reviewed the evidence. They've decided that they're happy with it, but a lot of campaigners and a lot of healthcare workers are not happy with that still. And I think going into, fingers crossed, we're not going to go into a third wave, but it's hanging over all of us at the moment, isn't it? And it's very concerning.
And your background's in psychiatric medicine, isn't it? And so what kind of mental strain has it been putting on healthcare workers, knowing that they're going into work and that they're not getting, seeing their colleagues die, having that fear that they're not going to be protected? And what does it really tell us about how we're valuing our healthcare workers?
Well, I mean, I think the public have been absolutely incredible and very, very supportive. And I actually don't have criticisms of how the public have responded to healthcare workers. But the response that we were hearing from the front line, from doctors in particular, because they're the people we represent, was really horrifying. The accounts that we were being sent, we've got a very close knit relationship with a large group of doctors, and we formed a community which only became more important during the pandemic. It already existed, but people would be private messaging me or emailing me, dozens of people a day, and honestly the stories and the way that they were telling those stories were really heartbreaking, and the things that we were expecting people to just put up with and endure week after week, month after month, it's really unbearable to revisit those emails now. One of the doctors on our team, for example, who's a consultant anaesthetist, was caring for her own consultant colleague in intensive care for months, and luckily he recovered. But the experience of going again and again into an environment where the PPE is almost running out every single day, and you know that you're potentially going to be put at risk, and then caring for your own colleague who's potentially dying. I mean, I just can't tell you how traumatizing that could be to people.
And one of the issues that has been raised as well is that people were being given PPE, but it was out of date. I mean, again, what kind of impact does that have on a staff member when they're being given something and they're not even sure or 100% positive that it is going to be safe or it is going to be effective?
The reassurance just wasn't there, particularly in the early months. And we were hearing from a lot of doctors who, for example, were immunocompromised, had a condition themselves that meant that their own immunity wasn't very good. Sorry, that's probably a very basic way of saying it. I mean, they perhaps would be more susceptible to developing an infectious disease and becoming very unwell with it. Also members who are pregnant, who might have other concerns about passing on the virus to vulnerable people that they lived with at home. And all of this would have been going through our members' heads as they were going to work every day, and to go to work and to be given insufficient PPE, but also to find that PPE was potentially out of date by up to 12 years in some cases, was terrifying. There's no other word for it. And we were being sent photos of people who'd had to go down to B&Q and just buy whatever was on the shelf in terms of some kind of protective mask. We were sent photos of people who'd invited friends and family over to create homemade PPE out of whatever was in the house. There were photos of GP surgeries where they'd just gone and bought a load of perspex, and they were trying to create a sort of almost like a cage around the reception area. I mean, it was awful and so unplanned, and no support was given. Some of the emails that were coming out to GPs and to other healthcare facilities would say things like, you're not going to receive any central supply of PPE, you're going to have to go to your local hairdresser or your school and see if they've got anything they can make for you. It was like a war zone for a lot of people.
And I think that war zone point is really important, isn't it? Because there's been a lot of rhetoric and discourse around heroes and all of this. And of course, the work that healthcare workers has done is incredible and showed great courage and dedication and loyalty to people. But these are people who didn't sign up to go to work and put their lives on the line. They're not in a war. They're doctors, they're nurses, they're porters. I mean, again, how does that kind of feel for workers who are like, I'm doing my job and yet suddenly I'm at huge risk?
I think for a lot of people, it felt unbelievably stressful. And, we didn't come into this pandemic with a well-resourced, well-staffed NHS. We were already missing 100,000 staff. We'd already had over £40 billion worth of cuts to the NHS during austerity years. And so it's an overstretched service, and people go above and beyond just in a routine way in the NHS. And so this put so much pressure on people, and they were just expected to absorb it. And coming out of this crisis, there hasn't really been a moment, I don't think, where people have reflected en masse at the collective experience of NHS workers in a meaningful way. I suppose it draws me on to the point about pay rises, purely because that's something that's being reviewed at the moment. And the knowledge that healthcare workers who, first of all, have seen real terms pay cuts of up to 30% over the last 11 years, but on top of that have risked their lives over the past year, and still the government is trying to give a real terms pay cut to these staff, is horrifying to me, to be honest.
And Julia, just lastly, what is every doctor's response to the announcement of the public inquiry in 2022? I mean, as Sian was pointing out, to this day, the Health and Social Care Secretary, Matt Hancock, is saying, no, everyone had the PPE that they needed. The government did everything we could. You know, we made sure we had those stockpiles eventually. Are you buoyed by the sense of an inquiry? Do you think it's coming too late? I mean...
I think, you know, we've got our legal cases next week, and regardless of the outcome of those cases, the important lessons need to be learned, and they need to be learned soon. There was, you know, the government ignored the recommendations, or some of the recommendations that came out of the exercise Cygnus, which was a simulation exercise done in 2016, which tested out how the UK would cope if we faced a pandemic. Those lessons must be learned now, and the government must go to healthcare bodies to learn about what has happened for them over the last year. They must go to healthcare staff and social care staff and learn the lessons, learn how to build infrastructure so the same thing doesn't happen again. In terms of the COVID inquiry itself, I and many other people, many of whom know a lot more about this than I do, are concerned because these inquiries tend to take an awful long time. If it's only going to be started next spring, the likelihood is that we're not going to get any outcomes for several years. And along with a lot of other people, I think I'm concerned that we're living in an era where potentially there could be multiple pandemics. So there's nothing to say that when COVID sort of becomes more contained, we won't face a similar threat. We may well do. And so we really need to learn those lessons quickly. So I suppose that's what I think needs to happen.
And is there anywhere people can get involved and help? I mean, if they're concerned about, you know, the what healthcare workers on the front line are still facing, I mean, is, you know, the websites and links that you can provide for our viewers?
Absolutely. So we have a Twitter account, it's at EveryDoctorUK, or I'm on Twitter at Julia Grace, and we run encrypted email accounts so that NHS staff can feed information to us if they feel that something is going on at work that they need to tell us about. We have really strong links with journalists and politicians across the board now. We are very lucky to have established good links with politicians throughout the pandemic, and so our job is to amplify the voices of NHS staff and patients as well. And so please come to us if there's anything you need to talk to us about. We're very fortunate that the public are starting to join Every Doctor as supporters as well, which is absolutely fantastic. They're being so generous in donating money every month to what we're doing. So if anybody would like to do that, please come to our website, which is www.everydoctor.org.uk. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you to you, Julia, and on behalf of Byline Times, you know, big thank you to your organisation and all of the doctors and frontline healthcare staff that it represents, and all of you out there who have literally put your lives on the line to protect us. Thank you so much. And Julia, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Just one last thing, if it's okay. We're calling it an Every Doctor night shift tonight. We've got an event happening in London to draw attention to the legal cases that are happening next week. So if everybody could keep an eye online and look up the hashtag What's the Plan, Matt? We're going to be making a lot of noise later on this evening.
Great. Thank you, Julia. Take
Thanks.
care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
What's the plan, Matt? That's the hashtag, and I think you'll see some fascinating events happening in London, but very, very disturbing. Byline Times, obviously we've covered a lot of the PPE scandal in terms of where the money went. And that's, we now know, thanks to our work, 1 billion contracts in COVID emergency non-compete contracts to Conservative Party donors, another 2 billion to Conservative Party associates. That, you know, billions, 1,000 million, that's a lot of money. But we did start, you know, tracking the number of care worker and health worker deaths, didn't we, Hardeep, this time last year? But with Nursing Notes UK, but it's now risen to 880. So you have this profiteering, we could call it that, and 880 deaths.
It is. I think it's really important what Julia was saying about, you know, day to day in our lives for all of us who are obviously not healthcare workers. It's not something we might think of immediately, that people are going into, you know, we're here tonight and this is our place of work. We've come here and we feel no threat whatsoever. And I think it's really significant that...
But if you did, hopefully a company would back you up and you know, give you support. And I must say, thanks to Sian, who's done some fantastic work on this for Byline Times.
But it's really significant that at the same time we sit here in our place of work, that, yeah, we don't often think that other people are going into their place of work right now facing
So we have one of the highest death rates
difficulties
in the world of, you know, COVID-19 anyway. I think when we last looked at it, now we've got the new figures, one of the highest healthcare deaths in the world. And that's the natural consequence. On a more cheery note, let's look at our print front page. We print a print edition every month of Byline Times, which
a newspaper,
an actual newspaper, a physical one. I haven't got the current copy here yet, and that is heavily curated by Hardeep. It's the only 25% of the best stuff you find online. It's redesigned, and a special redesign this month. And our front pages, which is reconceptualized, which kind of expresses a mixture of sadness and cover-up and disgust at over expended money against the wall. There's the famous wallpaper, which is subject to an investigation. How much a roll was it?
£800?
£800 a roll. There's the very, very moving wall opposite Parliament and the wall of St Thomas's Hospital.
The National COVID Memorial Wall.
Which sprung up overnight, where there are hearts for all the people who've died. Well, I suppose only some of them people written stories. And on the current edition, we also talk about the Red Wall, which didn't do so well for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. So I think I would just say thank you for a fantastic show, and I will thank, we have some new joiners on Patreon. Thanks, Alan Patterson, thank you. And now you've joined and everybody else has joined. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. We're quite tired. We've also done the Byline Times book, which we'll tell you about very soon. So we're going to knock off a bit earlier, but we're still going to be around in 5 minutes' time for about 20 minutes of Q&A.
Sian's going to be here with us.
I mean, Sian's got to stay because I've run out of energy. So come back in 5 minutes if you sign up on Patreon, and we'll answer every question and all those kind of naughty things we can't tell you on live TV. Meanwhile, thank you, Sian.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
And thank you very much for watching. Good night. We'll see you next week.
Good night.